BCFM 93.2. Bristol is our community.
And I'm joined on the phone now from Sweden by Chris Bollyn. Hi, Chris. Welcome to Dialect.
Hi, Tony. Nice to be with you.
Now, give us an idea, could you, about how you first met Jim Tucker, because that's who we're talking about today. He's a reporter from American Free Press who died on Friday, sadly. But I know you and I met up with him and you worked quite a lot with him, and I met the pair of you in Brussels, didn't we? Tell us how you first met Jim and how, what it was like working with him when you first met him.
Yeah, sure. My first job as a journalist was with Jim Tucker. I had joined the newspaper. It was a Spotlight at that time, and Jim Tucker. My first assignment was to be the photographer for the Bilderberg confab or conference, whatever you want to call it, that was happening in Genval, just outside of Brussels. So
that was the first time you worked with him, Chris. Interesting, because that was the first time I'd met him.
Yeah, that was the first time, and it was a very interesting time. We weren't quite sure. He wasn't quite sure on the location of the Bilderberg meeting, but we pretty much had it. He had it sussed out that it was at this specific hotel. So I went and stayed the night before in the hotel and scouted around inside the hotel, and I found signs that said steering committee and things like that, and I called back to Jim in Brussels, I think it was, and I told him for sure this is the place. And it was a very interesting conference because I was working for the first time as like a paparazzo, a photographer who was getting these pictures of these people who really didn't want to be photographed. And one of my best pictures from that meeting was of George Soros speaking off to the side with Carl Bildt, the current foreign minister of Sweden, who was at that time or had been the special envoy to the Balkans.
Yeah, so tell us a bit about Bilderberg, Chris, because Jim really made this his life's work, I guess, certainly the last 10 years of his life. And even before that, he was doggedly investigating where they were meeting, tracking them down, writing about them, and even had a conversation with the British Prime Minister, former British Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, about Bilderberg, her saying that she was very proud to have been denounced by this organisation. So who are they? Yeah,
it goes back a long way with Jim Tucker. He's been following them since, I think, the 80s or the 70s even. It's this group of, there's a steering committee or a group of people who are regulars, people who are like inducted members to the cult or to the group. These are, of course, people like David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger, who are at the top. And then there's a cadre of people who are fast members. And then they have these revolving members, people who come in for a meeting at a particular year, and these are basically, I would call them consensus-forming meetings. That's pretty much what I understand. Is that these big shots from both sides of the ocean, from the big guys in NATO, the Kissingers and the Rockefellers of the world, they then impose or coax their worldview and the plan for the next 12 months onto this very select group of several hundred men from high positions in the United States and across Europe and around the world. And, of course, what Jim Tucker found so reprehensible about the Bilderberg meeting was that elected members of the U.S. Congress and American politicians and people of that, public officials in the United States were attending these meetings at public expense. And these are truly the insider meetings. If there's any insider group, it would be the Bilderbergers, so that these people, when they know what's going to happen in the following year, they know which way to sell stocks. They know what things to hedge and what decisions to make. It's really the insider club, of the world.
But certainly the Western world and the NATO countries. But I mean, how did Jim? Because he was very famous for getting leaks from these conferences, and also for leaking the venue beforehand. Because the last thing in the world that the Bilderbergers want is publicity, and Jim was actually able to make sure that people knew where and when they were about to meet, or at least had a very good guess So how did he get this these leaked information? Maybe you can't tell us all about it, but this was one of the most important jobs Jim was doing. He was doing some real investigative journalism, which is so sadly lacking in the mainstream media in the Western world.
Yeah, there aren't very many journalists like Jim Tucker anymore. He was he's an old school journalist, and he did, research the old-fashioned way, calling people up, going to places where these people are likely to meet, talking to people, going to the Washington National Press Club, for example, and through the network of people and telephone calls, he was always able to find the location. And this is done, the old-fashioned way, talking to people. And there are no journalists, there are no investigative journalists anymore, and especially not like Jim Tucker.
Okay, so what about when it came to the meeting itself? Because this is a completely sealed off meeting, locked down. How on earth can you get leaks out from there, Chris?
Well, leaks, once the meeting has begun, I was with him in France, in Sweden, and in Belgium. At that point, we would try to talk to people who were insiders. Sometimes people who worked in the hotel, for example, would give us a list they had found in the trash basket or something. Remember, there was some lists, I think it was in Sweden. They were printed on red paper. They were, so that the point of printing them on red paper is that they can't be Xeroxed. But I think in Sweden we got the whole list of people who attended, and it's the old-fashioned way, getting people who are on the inside, like a person who works there, or who will give you some information. It's not that hard.
Okay, fascinating. So, now Jim is not around, it's not with us anymore. Do you think that's going to make a difference to whether these meetings are covered at all in the world?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. He's the dean of Bilderberg Studies. I don't see anybody that's going to carry it further. It was something that Jim Tucker had devoted a lot of his career to, and there is nobody who understands the group as well as he does. Nor I don't see anybody that would pick up the ball. I don't see how it's going. The Bilderberg people are probably very happy that Jim Tucker is no longer with us, because they will be getting a free ride now.
But why does the big networks like NBC, the BBC, the national state media we have in Europe, and the national newspapers, things like the New York Times, why do these people not cover these meetings? Because, you've got the richest and most powerful people in the Western world, including royalty. You've got David Rockefeller, who's basically like a giant country of himself, if you look at his wealth. When they're all getting together, you'd have thought that the mainstream press, and at least the public service media like the BBC would take an interest.
Well, Tony, from having been at some of these conferences, that the people who own these media outlets are often in attendance. They are often invited. Editors and very high-level journalists and people who own the media are Bilderberg attendees, and they have taken the same oath that everybody else has taken, this kind of oath of omerta, not to talk about it. So it's part of the secrecy of life in a modern Western world that people are allowed to conspire. The highest level people in our governments are allowed to conspire behind closed doors, and the media won't even talk about it. Jim Tucker used to say that if this was a collection of basketball players or football players or movie stars, anybody else, it would be reported on the front page news. But because these are the people who run our countries and run our media, it is absolutely not discussed at all.
Now, you just used the term omerta, which is something that's used by the mafia. Basically, you've got to keep your mouth shut, and this is a mafia term. Would you consider the Bilderberg in the same bracket?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. My experience there, I think you were there in Belgium. After I took that photograph, they had a break on the second day, first day, second day. I think it was the second day of the convention. they came out for a breath of fresh air on this little lake, and they weren't really expecting to have very many journalists out there, and there weren't very many. There was a lot of local people who wanted to see what was going on there. That was it. So I was clicking pictures of these guys that came out, and these are the former heads of the CIA and U.S. government and senators and what have you. And when I saw Carl Bildt come out with George Soros, I walked along with them, took some pictures, and I even ventured a question or two to Mr. Carl Bildt because, I know something about what's going on with him. And then there were some Belgian thugs, the security, so-called security for the Bilderberg conference. Then they started following me and chasing me, and they forced me to retreat into a nearby restaurant, and then they waited outside. And I had to escape from that place and run to the train station and get on a train back to Brussels because, they use mafia tactics. They don't want people talking about them or photographing them, and that's the kind of that's the game they're playing. It is a mafia.
Okay, Chris, thanks very much.
BCFM 93.2. Bristol is our community.